Congressman John Lewis dedicated his life to championing the causes of marginalized communities as a member of the U.S. House of Representatives for nearly 4 decades. He looked for necessary good trouble to advocate for equality. John Lewis shed his blood crossing the Edmund Pettus Bridge to fight for Black voters and voters of color to have equal access to America's electoral process. He demanded voter protection by the enactment of the 1965 Voting Rights Act. Recently, those voting rights have been under attack nationally by state legislators introducing and passing laws to suppress the participation of Hispanic, Black, and historically underrepresented voters in elections. Voting Right Coalition partners are coming together across America to fight back and demand preservation and expansion of voting rights. The Hispanic Federation would like to honor his legacy by bringing you this program. Now join us to welcome the President and CEO of Hispanic Federation, Frankie Miranda, with a very special message.
John Lewis' decades-long struggle to give voice to the vulnerable remains a critical issue in today's society. His actions inspire us as we face historical challenges regarding our right to freely choose who represent us, our families, our communities, and make decisions that define our future. His words remind us that the need to continue creating good trouble persist. Right after the 2020 election and the 2021 Georgia Senate runoff, a concerning pattern of attempts at voter suppression more clearly developed as several state legislatures introduced bills with the purpose and intent of reducing voter participation, especially within communities of color. In fact, the Brennan Center of Justice published a report in March of this year that counted 361 different provisions across 47 states that sought to restrict voter rights. To stop this concerted effort to suppress voter participation, we must assure that legislation such as the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act is passed in Congress. The federal protections included in this bill are vital and include restoring original protections granted in the landmark 1965 Voting Rights Act. I want to thank Congresswoman Kathy Castor for participating in today's conversation and providing us with much needed insight into Congress and how our community can get involved and make our voices heard. I also want to thank Kira Romero Kraft from Latino Justice ProDef and Andrea Centeno from MALDEF for sharing with us their expertise on this issue. As President and CEO of Hispanic Federation, an organization that empowers and fights for Latino rights, I am moved that we are hosting this program that honors the legacy of John Lewis. As John Lewis said, when you see something that is not right, not fair, not just, you have to speak up. You have to say something. You have to do something. And as such, Hispanic Federation is committed to advocating to protect and expand the critical voting rights that communities of color have fought so incredibly hard to achieve. Muchas gracias.
Thank you, Frankie, for such inspiring words, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Laudi Campo, and I'm the Deputy Director for the Hispanic Federation here in Florida. Today, we will speak with prominent Hispanic community leaders and a member of Congress about the history of voter suppression, where we are now in terms of voting rights access. What is the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Act? And what can the Hispanic voting community do to honor his legacy? But before we begin, let's remember a quote from the civil rights leader and good troublemaker, John Lewis.
The vote is precious. It is almost sacred. It is the most powerful, nonviolent tool we have in a democracy.
Joining us in this important conversation is the Vice President of Federal Policy and Advocacy for the Hispanic Federation, Ms. Laura Schibel, and Andrea Centeno from the Regional Council of Mexican American Legal Defense and Educational Fund.
Well, good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. I am so pleased and honored to welcome Andrea Centeno with the Mexican American Legal Defense and Education Fund, MALDEF. Andrea is the Regional Counsel in the DC office for MALDEF and our expert today on the history of voting rights and why we need laws to protect our voting rights. So thank you so much for being here, Andrea. I wonder if you could give us just kind of a brief history or overview of what voting rights are, why they're important, and what voter suppression is.
Certainly, and let me just start by saying thank you so much for having me here today to talk about these really important issues for our community and for the American public. And I'm so excited to be able to talk to you all about not just, the importance of working towards voting rights legislation, but what are the different ways that we see voter suppression and voter discrimination in our communities. So, for the Latino community, there has been a long history of discrimination against Latinos and their right to vote. And that's, a history that is obviously shared with many other communities across the country, with the African American community, Asian Americans, Native Americans. We're not alone in the fact that our voting rights are often attacked by the political establishment in power. But specific to Latinos, we see that voting rights or voter suppression and discrimination, they often come up in very common ways in which, the routine practices that have been used to discriminate against other voters often show up similarly in our communities. But what's unique is that Latinos often move into places that where minority populations or communities of color are growing, they're on the rise. And so certainly in places like Texas and California and other states where you have very large established Latino populations, you see a lot of voter suppression and voter discrimination targeted to the Latinos in that state or in that that city or county. But what we also have been seeing and have been seeing for quite some time is that when Latinos move to new areas of the country, and we see that a lot for economic reasons, right? So we've seen Latinos move, more into the South in more recent decades for work opportunities, growing pockets of Latino populations in the Midwest outside of, the more traditional locations like Chicago. In all of those new places, what you see is that when Latinos start to reach a certain point where they are occupying a really, sizable or at least important component of the electorate, that those practices that are often used to discriminate against communities of color are turned towards Latinos who are growing in an area. And so, the voter discrimination that we are working on to fight as voting rights advocates is really focused on trying to address what has been this country's long history of discrimination in voting, and ways that we can legislatively restore the protections that our communities once had under the Voting Rights Act, and to create new protections that are designed to address newer ways that voter discrimination and voter suppression is being used, and that we have seen in the past few election cycles.
Andrea, can you give us an example or some examples of those kinds of protections, that kind of discrimination, and why these protections are needed?
Certainly. So One of the key protections that we have had in the United States to protect voting rights has been the Voting Rights Act of 1965. That legislation, which has been updated and reauthorized over the years, so over the past several decades that it has been in place, those protections have really taken largely. I mean, there's a lot encompassed in the VRA, but one of the key protections that it includes was this scheme for looking at voting changes and determining whether those changes discriminated against communities of color, against certain voting populations. For instance, it used to be the practice that if you were in a state or a county or city that had a history of discrimination in voting, you would have to seek pre-clearance. That's what we call it, but it's really just some sort of pre-approval for your voting change from the federal government. You either went to the Department of Justice or you went to a 3-judge panel here in DC to get pre-approval for your voting change. And what really, the DOJ or the courts were looking for was whether that change would put the racial or language minority population in that jurisdiction, whether that's the county, the city, the state, what have you, worse off than they were before the change. And so this is what we called the pre-clearance process. What happened, most recently is that in 2013, there was a lawsuit called Shelby County versus Holder, which challenged the constitutionality of that scheme of selecting certain states based on a congressional record of discrimination in voting and discrimination in those states, to identify which states or sub-state jurisdictions. It didn't always have to be a state, it could be a county or some other jurisdiction that would have to ask for that permission. And in that case, the Supreme Court struck down the formula that was used to determine who had to get pre-approval. So in doing that, we ended up with no jurisdictions that are covered by this pre-clearance scheme. And so today there are no states, there are no counties, there are no local jurisdictions that have to get their pre-approval. And the only way to really get a state to have to do that at this particular point is to go through lengthy litigation and to convince a court to order that jurisdiction to go through pre-clearance. It's a very difficult process. It's very expensive. And that's another protection of the Voting Rights Act, where we have the ability to bring private lawsuits against a jurisdiction, against an election authority who is implementing a discriminatory voting change or voting practice and sue. But that litigation is very costly. MALDEF is one of those organizations that brings cases like that. Many other organizations, the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, the ACLU, the Lawyers Committee. The benefit of, the pre-clearance process under the VRA is that it allowed changes to be prevented from moving forward when they were going to discriminate against a racial or language minority in an area. And so it really saved us a lot in money and in time and in resources. And it's an efficient way to make sure that voting rights for everyone is secured, and there's that we don't compromise those rights by forcing someone to kind of be able to find the resources or be able to connect to organizations for us to bring those cases forward and to be able to win in court. And so what we're hoping for is we're going to push for federal legislation to really restore that formula so that we can bring back pre-clearance and restore the Voting Rights Act to make sure that we are doing everything we can to effectively and efficiently protect voting rights.
So if I'm understanding you correctly, the piece of the Voting Rights Act that used to make sure that jurisdictions did not pass or make changes to voting laws that ended up discriminating against certain voters, that is no longer in effect. And so the result is now laws are being passed all over the country that are going to have the effect of restricting voting rights. Can you talk a little bit about what's happening across the country now that we no longer have that protection in place?
Certainly. Without those protections, you're right. States are passing laws, local jurisdictions are passing voting changes that are either going to have the effect of discriminating against minority communities, and oftentimes they have the intent of doing that. So for instance, right after the Shelby County versus Holder decision came down in 2013, effectively gutting the pre-clearance scheme, the state of Texas moved forward with plans on a number of changes that would affect, voters in that state. Voter ID is one of them. The voter ID laws that Texas implemented, it was able to do that after the Section 5 pre-clearance scheme was no longer available to the federal government under the Voting Rights Act after this decision. And they cited that as, the reason they were going to move forward. Now we can move forward with these changes. In a similar vein, we had, there was a locality in Texas called Pasadena, Texas, where MALDEF brought litigation because after the Shelby County decision, when there was no need to go through, or there was no requirement to go through pre-clearance anymore, they could take whatever actions they wanted to. And so they decided to go ahead and move forward in Pasadena to change some of the structure of their city council composition. And so, they had a certain number of single member districts. They decided to change some of those districts to be at-large districts. And so what that means is that, at that particular point, the Latino community, the Mexican American community in Pasadena was growing. And so to prevent Mexicans from taking over a majority of the city council and from really flexing their political power, the city council decided to make a shift that would make it harder for Latinos to elect city council members. And so we brought litigation there. It was very clear that it was motivated by discriminatory intent towards the Latino community, towards the Mexican American community. And in fact, that's what a judge found, that it was done on purpose. And so, thankfully we were able to win in court there and prevent that action from actually moving forward. But as I said before, private litigation can be really expensive. It can take a long time. It's not as efficient as having a pre-clearance process. And as many of us watching today, or many of you watching, this panel today, and as many of the other speakers are going to talk about, we see new voter suppression laws that are being debated and taken up in states across the country. That's happening in Texas, it's happening in Georgia, it's happening in Florida. And it has, we have been seeing how the effort to suppress the vote, in these different states affects the ability of certain communities to actually participate and to participate to their full extent, whether that be because the poll sites have been changed to make it either harder to get to your poll site location, or the lines, the number of people that are assigned to that poll site have just exploded. And so you have to wait in long lines. Other types of barriers to your registration, types of changes that make it harder for you to actually cast a ballot that makes it likely for your community to elect someone, elect their candidate of choice. The need is very urgent for Congress to act and to pass legislation that will help us bring back tools, really effective tools to protect people's right to vote and to make sure that everybody has equal access to the ballot.
Yeah, thank you so much. I mean, it's really alarming. And the reason we're doing this today is because it's astonishing watching all of these bills. I mean, it's not even a bill a day. Like, it's bills being introduced every day around the country. We're coming up on 400 maybe this year alone. Voting rights, voter suppression bills that do everything from make it illegal to give somebody a bottle of water when they've been standing in line for 5 hours waiting to vote, or it's a hot day, to shortening the hours that you can vote, making it harder for people who have to work and can only go before work or after work, or have childcare issues, all of these things being proposed, some of them being passed. And it really is a crisis that, if we do not get action at the federal level, is going to result in fewer people having the ability to cast their vote and have their voice be heard. It's Latinos, it's people of color, it's working people, and it really is urgent. So I really appreciate all of the work that MALDEF does, that's for darn sure. But just describing that Pasadena case, I mean, can you imagine having to try to do that in 400 places around the country? I mean, it would be impossible without action at the federal level. It's going to be really difficult to protect the rights of voters who turned out in record numbers in the last election. We should be doing everything to encourage voting, not make it harder. So thank you, Andrea. Thank you, MALDEF, for all that you do to help protect the right to vote for Latinos and for others. And just really thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. And I invite anyone who is interested in engaging in these issues to please reach out to MALDEF, reach out to our partners, reach out to the Hispanic Federation to find ways that you can engage, and certainly to call on your Congress members, call on your senators to move legislation forward. It's incredibly urgent. We're going to be moving into the first redistricting cycle this year, where we won't have the protections of the Voting Rights Act since 1965. And redistricting is a huge deal for political empowerment for our communities.
Well said. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you, Laura and Andrea, for your contribution in this program that aims to bring light to such an important subject like voting rights. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce you to Congresswoman Kathy Castor. She was elected in 2006 and represents Florida 14th Congressional District. She was the first woman to represent Pinellas and Hillsborough counties in the U.S. Congress. Bienvenida, Congresswoman Castor.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you, Congresswoman, for honoring us with your presence today. Let's start with this question. Could you please explain to our viewers why we need federal voting rights protection?
Well, voting is fundamental to our democracy. It's how everyone expresses their views, elects their representatives, and it's what makes America, America. Voting should be convenient, and yes, it is a privilege, a right, but it needs to be treated as such, and people need to be encouraged to vote so that our democracy works, and it works for everyone.
We agree with you. In the Hispanic Federation, our main goal is to empower our communities, and definitely voting and voting education is an essential part of this process. Now, can you talk about the John Lewis Voting Rights Act?
Well, a few years ago, the United States Supreme Court gutted our most important voting rights act, and the Congress now is responding through the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. And I'll give you an example. In Tampa and Hillsborough County, we had issues in the past with a supervisor of election moving polling places, not providing notice to the citizens. We want to print ballots in different languages so that everyone understands what is on the ballot. And there was always a requirement for Hillsborough County, Tampa Hillsborough, to go to the Justice Department and make sure that adhered to our voting standards federally, called pre-clearance. Well, the U.S. Supreme Court, they gutted that requirement. So now we're on very shaky ground where local supervisors of elections or states can enact certain voting laws or requirements without that preclearance requirement. So we want to reinstitute that and also make some reforms so that voting is convenient and everyone has access to the ballot box.
Talking about reforms, Congresswoman, can you talk a little bit about H.R. 1 or For the People Act?
Yes, thank you so much. At the outset of the new Congress, we've passed H.R. 1, the For the People Act. And the reason that it's labeled number 1 is it is the most important to our democracy. It focuses on rooting out corruption. It makes sure that special interests that have a lot of money do not have undue influence in our elections. It says that if you are going to fund elections, you have to be transparent so that everyone knows when that TV ad comes on the screen and you're left scratching your head and saying, wow, that was an ad, I don't know if it's true or not, that you actually have to disclose who paid for it. Then it includes very important civil rights protections, and we aim to make voting a lot more convenient. Same-day registration, being able to vote by mail, making sure that state legislators do not gerrymander districts unfairly. We just have the census results in the state of Florida. Florida will gain a congressional seat. We want to make sure that the Florida legislature draws those districts in a fair way and they don't draw them to maximize their political power. So H.R. 1, that's why it's called For the People Act, to strengthen our democracy, to root out corruption, and to strengthen our voting systems and civil rights.
Congresswoman Castor, what can Floridians do to protect the right to vote?
You really need to, everyone needs to pay attention and be an engaged citizen. We're so fortunate to live in the United States of America. But with that privilege also comes enormous responsibilities to be an engaged citizen. And what you want to have a level playing field. You don't want the special interest to have a lot of money that contribute to candidates or causes to tip the scales in their favor. We want a level playing field, and the only way to do that is to make sure that everyone can register to vote in a timely fashion, that they have access to the ballot box. That means not restricting the time and manner of voting, that we make it convenient, that we've learned that vote by mail is convenient and it works, not restricting that. So these are fundamental reforms that we think need to be enacted nationally.
Congresswoman, what is the current state of play with this federal legislation?
Well, right now it's passed the House of Representatives and now it goes to the United States Senate. We passed it last year, but Mitch McConnell and Republicans in the Senate have blocked it. Now Democrats are in charge, but we still need 60 votes to bring it up for a vote there. And then I'm confident President Biden will sign it. So the most effective thing is to let our senators know, Senator Rubio and Senator Scott, that you believe in voting rights. You think civil rights are a priority in America, in the state of Florida. You've watched these voter suppression bills across the country and right here in our own state. And you want the right and ability to vote. And you don't want politicians and the special interests controlling how that is done.
Thank you, Congresswoman Castor, for the work that you and your colleagues are doing to ensure voting rights in the United States.
Yeah, let's all work together in honor of John Lewis, who marched and bled and fought for everyone's equal access to the ballot box. John Lewis, we can act in his memory, in his honor on a day of action.
After such an important conversation with Congresswoman Castor, let's move on to local and state laws. To talk about this, let's welcome Kira Romero. Kira is the managing attorney for the Southeast Office of the Florida Latino Justice, PARDELF, where her current role has her focusing on immigrant rights, voting rights, economic justice, and criminal justice reform. Bienvenida, Kira.
Muchísimas gracias. Un placer estar con ustedes. I'm thrilled to be here. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kira. We're excited to have you here today. Kira, could you please give us a little historical context on voting rights in Florida?
Sure. So Florida has had a very long history of discrimination against members of minority groups that has hampered their ability to register, to vote, and generally to participate equally in the democratic process. Like all of the southern states, except for North Carolina and Tennessee, Florida disenfranchised even free people of color before the Civil War. Um, Florida, since that time, has always had discriminatory laws, something that is known as Jim Crow laws, which specifically targeted African American descendants of Black slaves from voting. The legislature even authorized a poll tax during the Convention of 1885. Despite being a very urbanized southern state, I think when most people think of Florida, they don't really think of the Deep South. Florida still remains a segregated state in terms of schooling. And it wasn't until the passage of the Voting Rights Act in 1965 that Florida really took steps against disenfranchising minority groups. That even includes not providing Spanish language documents to a large Latino community in the state of Florida. And that has still continued even through the 1990s when Florida did enter into a compact to provide Spanish language documents to parents of Spanish language dominant students and Spanish language dominant parents. So Florida remains in that path. We could even talk a little bit about Amendment 4. Amendment 4 has its roots in Jim Crow laws that disallowed African Americans from voting, started with Jim Crow laws that penalized African Americans for things that had a lot to do with them being enslaved, and then codified those laws and made it part of the voting system to the effect that when Florida passed in 1968 a law to disenfranchise folks with felony convictions, those laws had roots in Jim Crow laws, despite that particular instance being challenged in court. Those laws stayed on the books, and we found ourselves in 2018 passing Amendment 4 to amend Florida's constitution to provide that folks who have felony charges or convictions would then be allowed to vote again. And we saw the response of the Florida legislature then to really try to change the will of the people by then requiring that folks pay fees and fines in order for them to win their voting rights back. And that is still in effect today, although folks who have completed all of their sentencing as per the Florida Constitution may be able to go ahead and register to vote. For anyone who is unclear and doesn't know that the legislature's will still has the effect of disenfranchising for folks who still have fees and fines that they need to pay. And so Latino Justice, as part of our mission, we work to protect the voting rights of all Floridians, and in particular folks who are impacted because of language ability, because they're part of the so-called minority languages, which include Spanish, as well as folks who may be impacted by disenfranchisement laws, such as the felony conviction issues here in the state of Florida.
A lot of work has been done by organizations like yours, but there's still so much to do. Kira, what can people in Florida do to protect their right to vote?
That's a great question. And I think the best thing to do really is to go ahead and register to vote. Being able to vote in the state requires U.S. citizenship. So that's number one. And if you are a U.S. citizen and have never been convicted of a felony in the state or have a felony conviction in another state, then you should go ahead and register to vote. If you do have a felony conviction and have a question, you can absolutely reach out to our organization. You can also reach out to other organizations such as our partner organization, FRRC, if you have a question about your criminal history or background. But other than that, if that is not an issue, then I think the most important thing to do is to really vote in every election. In the state of Florida, like some other states, there are elections every single year. There are municipal elections, city election, county. There's just there are always the majority of the positions that are available are elected positions, which means that it's typically competitive. There are candidates out there who are trying to get your vote. And, these things are the things that affect us on the daily, meaning that someone who represents you, for example, in a school board position is someone that can be vitally important because that is the person that will be representing your district in terms of how the education is managed for the school that your children are assigned to attend. And those things can be vitally important, from roads to taxes. There's just so many things that involve our local legislature. And so it's not just the federal elections, the big presidential elections, which are obviously important, but also your state, local elections. They determine things such as voting rights. And that is vitally important in a democracy, and why we encourage every voter to find out what is at stake and to try to educate themselves about voting, and then fully to exercise their right to vote if they have that privilege to do so. And then the other thing that I would impress upon, especially to all of the folks of our Spanish language dominant community, is that they have the right to request their ballot in Spanish throughout the entire state. And in most Florida counties, you have the right to request assistance if you need assistance and need the material in Spanish so that you can cast a fully informed vote. And that is something that we feel very strongly about. It is something that is part of the civil rights movement that we fought for, and is part of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 that had later been amended to include and make sure that minority voters would receive language material so that they could understand what they were voting for and exercise their vote. So I think that in a state like Florida, which is has a large Latino Hispanic community, I think it's very important for all of our Latino voters to exercise that right and to ask for their information in Spanish.
Kira, I like that you bring to our attention local elections. These are people that have a direct impact in us, such as city commissioners, supervisor of elections, the tax collector, for example. So these are important things that we also have in mind. Me coming from Puerto Rico, we have elections every 4 years. Here, there's every other year that we have elections. So we have to be very aware of this, because these are the people who, as you mentioned, they have direct impact in us. But I would like to hear a little bit more about what bills are we anticipating to have an impact in Florida voters.
One of the things that I think is vitally important for folks to know is that elections in Florida, it's a 365 day a year business. Because elections are run almost every year in the state of Florida, different county, state elections. That means that the laws change to update systems, but also to make sure that the administration of elections, which really governs how our local officials run elections. And we have such a varied state where, you go from Miami-Dade County, the largest county in the state, to a small county such as Gadsden, which is a very rural difference from Miami-Dade County. They have to, of course, meet their voters where they're at. And so these rules can change. And right now, currently, we are fighting against these two bills, Senate Bill 90 and House Bill 7041, which are attacking the right to vote via the vote by mail system. So Florida has enjoyed a very liberal opportunity to request a vote by mail ballot. A vote by mail ballot means there are 3 ways of voting in Florida. You can vote early, you can vote on election day, or you can vote by mail. And vote by mail, obviously during the COVID-19 pandemic, was a form of voting that was used widely by voters across the state. And no surprise to anyone who is concerned about health and public safety. And so it was a record turnout. And really, Florida did a tremendous job in terms of counting the ballots, in large part because of canvassing rules that were changed. But a lot to do also with elections officials who really worked with organizations that were trying to monitor the way that the system might change so that it could meet the voters where they're at and not disenfranchise voters, in particular voters of color. We know that voters of color, Latino voters, African American voters, Asian American voters, that their ballots are discarded when you do especially a vote by mail ballot because of signature matching, for example. So these bills, Senate Bill 90 and House Bill 7041, is trying to create obstacles for voters to be able to vote by mail, which means that what we enjoyed in the general election of November 2020, the fact that we had an ample use of ballot boxes, that the supervisors did an excellent job in making sure that voters could quickly and easily deliver back their vote by mail ballot. Now the legislature has taken it upon themselves to go ahead and try to roll back measures so that voters have a more difficult time casting their vote by mail ballots, meaning they're going to be requiring ID. They're also going to be, or they're suggesting to require ID when delivering a vote by mail ballot, also trying to limit who may deliver a vote by mail ballot on behalf of a voter. It is difficult to talk now specifically about other provisions of these laws that are proposals that are being floated because we're within the last days of the legislative session here in Florida. And those bills are still being argued. They're being debated as we speak. So we will see if those bills pass. It is expected that some form of bill will pass. But again, they are considered to be obstacles to voters electing to use vote by mail in a way that was safe. There was no incident, no reported evidence of fraud during the November 2020 election with the way the supervisors administered their elections. And so there is no reason, no foundation for these bills other than to curtail the ability of voters, and we believe voters in particular of color, to be able to access the ballot and in particular use the vote by mail system as it stands today.
Kira, are there current coalitions or organizations leading the effort, and how can Floridians plug in to help?
Sure. So we are part of a large statewide coalition. When I say we, it's Latino Justice PRLDEF, and PRLDEF stands for the Puerto Rican Legal Defense and Education Fund. We're part of a statewide coalition that includes Hispanic Federation, that includes a large number of our partner organizations, Common Cause, All Voting is Local, the ACLU of Florida, the Southern Poverty Law Center, so many different organizations, and Florida Rising that work to empower voters, that work to educate voters, that work to register voters. At Latino Justice, we focus primarily on election protection work, meaning we have nonpartisan poll monitors at the polls in as many elections as our resources will allow us to participate in, to make sure that voters have access to the ballot, that they are able to access the information in language they best understand, and to help any voters who may have questions. The voting system can be very complicated to navigate, and in particular for voters who don't have identification cards, who may have moved recently from different places. For example, in Puerto Rico, you cannot use your Puerto Rican identity document to vote in the state of Florida. So we do voter protection activities and coordinate with all of the other partner organizations around the state. For anyone that is interested in working in this area, we accept volunteers. We have poll monitors that work during the election cycles, especially when there are elections that we believe need additional assistance in terms of poll monitoring, because we think it's going to be a heavy turnout, or because we're in a community that we know there's a growing population of Spanish language dominant voters. And so we try our best to also work with supervisors of elections to make sure that they have the resources and support that they need in order to serve the communities. So anyone who's interested we urge you to call Latino Justice PRLDEF. You can call your supervisor of elections and also ask how you may help. You can also volunteer or work. You get paid poll monitor positions through the supervisors of elections, and they're paid well. And we're always looking to increase diversity with poll monitors, because it's essential to have bilingual Spanish and English poll monitors, especially in the communities where we have large populations that need the assistance. Thank you so much, and thank you to Hispanic Federation for this wonderful event, and to honor John Lewis is so important, especially for our community, to understand that this was not a right that was granted. It was a right that we had to fight for and that we continue to fight for. Florida has a long history of discrimination against voters that continues to this day, and the fight continues on. We want to make sure that everyone is able to access their ballot, and that if folks need assistance to meet the requirements, that we stand here at the ready to assist them, but also to fight for their rights to vote in the state, and also to get the information that they need in the language that they prefer, and in Spanish as well. So thank you so much. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach back out to me.
Thank you, Kira, for sharing with us such vital information. I really like and enjoy speaking with you, and I know our viewers did too. Now, let's move with Frederick Velez, Hispanic Federation National Director of Civic Engagement, who will guide Florida voters into vital next steps and actions to ensure every voter right in the Sunshine State. Frederick?
Thank you, Laudi. And thank you to Congresswoman Castor, to Kira, to Andrea for this great update and this amazing analysis on the John Lewis Voter Rights Act and how passing it will protect our community's rights. If you want to take action after all this amazing information that you've seen and heard, you can do it. And there's a couple of ways that we can take action. Number one, the first step is that if you're an eligible voter, make sure that you're registered to vote. Also make sure that your information is updated. That means that your residential address is up to date, that the signature that you're using matches your voter issued ID. And this is important because it's those small details that put up barriers for our communities and that make our voter and that basically makes our votes not count with all these little barriers that happen. Another thing that you can do is vote. People who end up voting are the ones who elect the people that are making decisions, or in some cases, blocking some of the laws that can protect our community or benefit our community. So when you go vote, make sure that you understand the candidate's platform, that you know if they're running for office, again, if they want to be reelected, or if this is their first time, and also what kind of legislation or issues they're proposing, and how that makes you feel and how that aligns with your values. It's those little things that will help make sure that people that are elected to office reflects the values of the communities that they got elected to represent. The other thing that you can do is you can talk to your elected officials. Remember that representatives and senators are here to serve you. They're here to represent you. So if you live in Florida, right now, you can contact your senators, Rick Scott and Marco Rubio, and tell them how you feel about the John Lewis Voter Rights Act. Tell them that you want them to pass it, that you want them to make sure that they protect the voter rights of your community. After I'm done talking, you're gonna see that we're gonna put up two QR codes in the screen. One of them will take you to a voter registration link so that you can find out and make sure that your information is updated. And the second one will take you to a phone to action platform where you can actually communicate and connect with your elected officials to let them know how you feel. I wanna thank you for being part of this, and I wanna thank you for taking action to protect our community's voting rights.
From the Hispanic Federation team, we want to thank you and all the speakers for joining us today. It was my pleasure to be your moderator. But before we leave, let's remember a quote from John Lewis. Get in good trouble, necessary trouble, and help redeem the soul of America. Hasta pronto.